Hi, my name's Keith Cooper of Northlight Images, and in this video I'm going to specifically look at using a Canon lens on a Fujifilm camera. In particular, I'm going to be looking at the Canon TS-E24mm F3.5L. It's a tilt shift lens, 24mm tilt shift lens. It's the Mark II version, which is better optically than the Mark I version, quite appreciably, and I'll come back to that in the context of using it on this, the GFX100S, if you're looking for tilt shift lenses to use on this. Now, at the moment, Fuji don't have any tilt shift lenses in the G mount. They are bringing out 2 of them this year, and I will be testing those as soon as they're available to have a look at. But this is about having a look at TS-E24. Now, TS-E24 I use a lot for my architectural interior photography. I also use the TS-E17. Now, I'll be looking at that separately because 17mm on the GFX large format sensor, it's a small medium format sensor I should say, 33x44, is the equivalent to about 13mm, and that is very wide. Now, I've looked at the 15mm Lauer shift lens, and I've looked at the 20mm Lauer shift lens, but only on 35mm full frame. So I've got lots more information if you want to know about this, and I've written a book about how to use tilt shift lenses, so that covers a lot more stuff about the details of it. But really, this is just looking at this, the 24mm. Why might I want to use it? Well, it's a good lens. I've used it for several years. I don't have any problems with it. Here it is on the GFX when I was out yesterday taking some test shots to have a look at this. Now, I will be doing some more written stuff about this with more photos and examples and that, but this is really just looking at this particular lens. I'm also only looking at shift in this instance because this is a lens I find I don't use very often with tilt. Most of the time I'm using shift to do correct for convergence of verticals. The classic reason you use shift is that if you're looking at a building and the camera's level, then the sides of the building are parallel. It looks okay. You tilt the camera upwards, the building looks as if it's falling over backwards. That's why you would use a little bit of shift. I'll show an example of that in a moment, of why I would actually use it. But I'm using this because it's a Canon EF mount lens with a photodiox adapter from EF to G mount. Now, because this particular lens does not have an aperture ring on it, you need electronic controls to operate the lens here. It also means that the lens data, albeit only the focal length and aperture, appears in EXIF data. There are no tilt shift lenses at the moment which encode shift or tilt data in the EXIF for use for later corrections if you want to do it. That's an area where I'm convinced we're going to see changes in that. There is Hasselblad have an adapter for their lenses which encodes the shift and tilt data, which is used for corrections, but nothing for this at the moment. I've got some reviews of the Hasselblad stuff if you're curious. I put a link to all my reviews, related reviews and things on the notes for this video if you want to sort of follow up for some more detail. But here we go. This is 100 megapixel, great. Is the lens up to it? Well, I'll dispel that one pretty sharpish. The lens is more than adequate to use on the 100 megapixel sensor here. If you set the camera in 35mm mode, it does an automatic crop to just the size of a 35mm sensor. You've still got 60 megapixels then. Compare that with the 50 megapixel 5DS that I use normally for my work, have done for several years. The lens is perfectly adequate for that. So's this one on a crop. It's when you try going, putting much shift and things that you're going to start noticing issues with the wider one here. But as I say, this is just about the 24. Now, let's have a look at some examples. This is while I was out yesterday morning on a walk to where I normally do my test shots. This has got a moderate amount of rise in it. That's vertical shift. The verticals are parallel. This is actually handheld. You get image stabilization in this as well, which you don't get in my 5DS. Now, I've used this lens with Canon R5 and it works great on that, as you'd expect, but you know, this image stabilization for lenses like this is new to me. I like using shift lenses handheld. This lens on the 5DS would be my normal sort of walk around general purpose lens for if I'm visiting somewhere and just want to take some snaps. I will use one of these. I'm quite happy using shift handheld. Tilt's another matter. Tilt on these, I'll have to come back to that because it's quite specialised, the use of it, and there's an awful lot of misconceptions about how useful tilt is. Suffice to say, if this didn't have tilt on it, well, it would be a pity, but I wouldn't really worry about it that much. That's why the two Laowa lenses, the 15mm and the 20mm shift lenses, are quite useful. Tilt just isn't as useful as people tend to think it is. Yes, it has very distinct uses, but not always. So there we go, classic shot. I've looked at it, I've got the camera level, I've used the internal level in it, and I've shifted the lens upwards to get a bit here. This is not at full shift. This particular lens has 12mm of shift. That means the lens will physically shift 12mm in any direction that you want. That's what causes the shift of it. Here I've got no problems in it. I haven't gone for really strong shift. I'll show what happens when you do in a bit. But here I've just got a perfectly usable shot of this student accommodation reflected in part of the river here. Just, you know, it's a nice blue sky. I got reflection, perfectly good shot, 100 megapixels worth. Probably I'm going to say not many of my clients would appreciate if I sent them 100 megapixel images, but just because I'm sending the equivalent of 20 megapixel images doesn't mean you don't get an advantage from all those megapixels to start with. I looked at that when I first got the 50 megapixel 5DS and found that having basically lots more megapixels to play with, when you reduce the size of your images, it improves the image quality quite noticeably. It's one of those sort of side benefits of lots of megapixels. I'm not looking in this instance at the multi-shot stitching mode of this, which takes 16 shots. I'm more convinced than ever, having tried it at times, that that's ideally a studio sort of thing. It's not sort of something I would consider outdoors as it's currently implemented in this, and especially in the Canon R5 where it just outputs JPEGs. Yeah, anyway. So that's it. Now let's just go to a basic shot. The equivalent focal length on this, and when I opened the images, I processed them in Camera Raw in Photoshop. It gives me the equivalent focal length and tells me that this is equivalent to 19mm. Yep, so this is equivalent to using the Nikon PCE19 lens on full frame. Gives you an idea of the difference between them. PCE19 is a nice lens. I've got a detailed review of that one, and on a Z5, I believe. I can't remember what camera I tested it on, but it's a very nice lens. Definitely shows the difference between that and the older Nikon PCE lenses. They do show their age. Nikon, ideally, I think, should start looking, and they probably are, looking at some Z-mount versions of the PCE lenses. A new set of those would give them a very nice range of lenses to use. There is a PCE24. Quality-wise, it's not up to the quality I've noticed in the Mark II version of this, but it's better than the original version, which goes back to the 1990s of the tilt shift, 24mm Canon tilt shift. So there's a picture. No shift, just a straightforward picture. We've got a nice picture, well exposed. It's a pretty enough looking picture. Now, what about, because I don't want all that foreground in it, I'll lift the lens. This is using a tripod, by the way. I do use tripod for much of my paying work. It's just personal stuff. I don't like carrying tripods around with me. I use wide lenses. Give me image stabilization as well, and I'm happy with that. But let's have a look what happens when I shift the lens upwards. We've got a different view. Notice no vignette. This is with moderate few millimeters of rise, vertical shift. No vignetting issues whatsoever. This was taken, and I've been through shots, doing a sequence of shots, and I'll include this in sort of written stuff. It's rather than here. This, where I've stepped through apertures to look at how vignetting changes and things like that, I found that by the time I get to F6, 7, 8, with small amount, I'm getting good quality out of this. If you're looking at using lenses, adapted lenses on GFX here, or even the GFX50 as well, which has got the same size sensor, if you're looking at that, it does pay not to have a paranoid fascination with diffraction limits. Anyone who writes to me and starts off telling me that the diffraction limit of such and such of this sensor is X, Y, or Z, I'm immediately thinking, yeah, have you actually tried that? Have you tried it, tested it with real images, sharpening, all kinds of, how you'd had? Have you looked at it for real? Or is this, yeah, the classic diffraction limit problem? Yeah, I just don't worry about it. It is something that is there. It affects things sometimes. I have been known for depth of field reasons and other creative reasons to use f/18. I rarely go to f/22. That does start to soften things, but there's nothing wrong with small apertures. Yeah, I know some people get really bothered by it, but yeah, just take the photos. That's what counts. Anyway, so we've got a bit of rise there. I'll just go back. There we go. You can see that, and yeah, that's it. I'm noticing at this point, because I know this scene very well, I'm thinking, yeah, this is quite wide. In fact, 19mm equivalent is a bit wide. I can see why the Fuji 30mm tilt shift that is on its way would be it'll give you slightly longer than this one as a native setting. So 30mm, what's that equivalent? Going to be equivalent to about 26 something on that. It's going to be wide. I haven't tried it yet. I don't know. I will do it, and I will compare it to this and some other lenses, but something a little longer would be useful here. I don't have a TS-E50 or 45, so I can't test those on this particular one. But those longer focal lengths, which to me on 35mm are just a little bit longer than I want, would be ideal on this if they've got the coverage. And that's something I will be coming back to and having a look at. In fact, see this building on the side here? This is a gallery. If I go to that, I'm now right beside the gallery, and I'm looking up, and I've shifted up, and we have the pretty much full vertical shift here. So the camera is pointing at about eye level. I've got the camera level, and I've shifted the lens up. Now, actually, this shot is not just shifted up. This one I'm using diagonal shift. I'm pointing the camera this direction here, but the camera the lens has been shifted diagonally. Now, I've got videos looking at, and articles as well, looking at diagonal shift. Diagonal shift is something that people use to shift lenses don't tend to think about so much. They tend to think in terms of up and down, taking multiple shots, stitching them, perhaps left, right, taking multiple shots, stitching them for panoramics to get a wider field of view. But diagonal and pointing the camera in a different direction has all kinds of interesting effects. In particular, if you take pictures and you've got clouds in them, you can change the apparent direction where the clouds are coming from, the way they angle out of the shot with wide angle lenses. But if you're curious about that, I've got a video specifically looking at diagonal and landscape, which shows some of the effects, which you can do very well with this. But what I really want to show on this one is this bit of vignetting in the bottom corner here. Now, given the camera is pointing this direction, and I've shifted, there should be no vignetting whatsoever at all in this. And this is where we come to something that I would hope won't get in a native tilt shift lens from Fuji actually. It's because we're going through adapters here, and we're going through a smaller lens mount. Now, this problem would be far worse on the PCE19 because that uses the F mount. And one of the problems with lenses like this, when you use something like the F mount, is it's very small compared to these, which is why Nikon redo their tilt shift lenses, PCE lenses, in Z mount. That really will show the benefits of the Z mount, which is a huge great aperture. Z mount is more like this one, but with a 35mm sensor in it. It's very large. I applaud Nikon for choosing that and making the break from the F mount, because there are many aspects. There's some great F mount lenses, but when it comes to things like this, the F mount was quite restrictive in aspects of lens design, and that you won't get on the Z mount when they get round to doing the lenses. But so we've got some here, and that is caused by physical vignetting of the mount here. This, as you get to smaller apertures, if you go right the way up to f22, you'll see it's quite a sharpish shadow. This is shadowing caused by the mount, and this is at extreme shift. So I'm doing extreme shift that way. Now, in this top corner here, it's not towards the image circle of edge of the image circle of the lens. Image circle of the lens, just in case you're not sure, and take this handily convenient Fuji lens, which is the 20-35 zoom, which I got with this one, but I'm testing tilt shift. If you imagine the image projected by the lens onto the sensor, it is a circular image. Now, that's how come shift works. Normally the idea is you slap the sensor, the whatever shape it is, in the middle of that image circle, and there you go, that gives it. Now, when you shift it, the lens, you're running up against the edge of the image circle, and here I'm noticing some vignetting on the top here. Now, that's not a problem. It can be dealt with to some extent in Photoshop, and I'll show an example of that later. But the thing to notice is you would expect vignetting. If you didn't know about the mount issues, you would not expect it here. You think, well, you probably wouldn't get it here. You'd certainly expect it here because we're doing the diagonal shift, but you wouldn't expect much here, and we don't get it. So that's just showing that two bits of vignetting, one expected, one less expected. Now, how much annoyance this is depends on what you take the photograph of and how much there is detail in here you can correct with Photoshop. Here the image is getting dark, you may be able to correct it. By the way, auto corrections on these do not work. The only correction I know in Camera Raw, you can fix chromatic aberration. It works with shifted lenses. There's a very little chromatic aberration with this one, slightly more on this, but this one is adequately fixed by the automatic controls. So you've got that, there you go, there's that image there. That's with diagonal shift, and it gives a different view. If you're curious about what the difference is, as I say, I've got videos that look specifically at diagonal shift, and hint, hint, he says, pointing to the book. Again, yes, I cover it in that. But, so it's that. Now, let's have another quick look at basic shift. There we go. I'm looking at this building. I've got no shift. I've got the camera level, so the verticals are fairly true. There is, by the way, fairly minimal distortion from this lens. You may be able to see a bit of it on some subjects when shifted, but it's at a pretty low level. I don't really have to fix it very often. It shows a little bit more here on the 17, but as I say, we're just talking 24 here. I don't need to worry about it really. So there's a picture. I'm just looking dead straight ahead. Well, yeah, I've got lots of foreground here, which I probably don't want. If I'm taking a picture of the building, I want to add some rise to that, some vertical shift, and whoops, go the right way. There we go with a bit of vertical shift. Just go back. You can see how much I've shifted the lens upwards, and you'll notice no vignetting, little slightly darker at the corners here, not that much, but this bit of building is not being brightly lit, so it's quite dark anyway, so we've got that. But if I go to the full 12mm of shift, you'll see we get some vignetting here, vignetting here. We get a small amount here from the lens mount, and no, hardly noticeable here at all. Maybe just a little bit here, you can just notice it. But the main bit is this is vignetting from the edge of the image circle, likewise here. It means that if you're seeing that in this area here, fine detail is going to be lost. Now, I've tested images from this using Topaz Sharpen AI, using the camera shake correction, because the kind of distortions and lack of detail you get here looks slightly similar to camera shake, and that means that if you have an image like this and you absolutely need this amount of shift and fine detail in the corner, then there are tools which will fix it. Ideally I wouldn't want to do it, but what it means is that if you're using this lens on 35mm, you've got plus or minus 12mm of shift. Now at 12mm of shift, you expect a little bit of softness in the shifted corners, so up here. But if you're using it on the medium format here, it's ideally keep it to plus or minus 8 or so. Beyond that, it will work. And this is why I mentioned this lens being much better than the original TS-E24. The TS-E24, the original one, actually had red marks on it to indicate the maximum reasonable amount of shift. If you went over that amount of shift, you were likely to get softness and other problems with it. This version, the second version of the TS-E24, has the larger image circle, which means on 35mm sensors you don't get problems like that. So they made the Canon, in the Mark II version, they made the image circle larger. The larger image circle with shift, less problems with it. So if you just allow for this thing, if you're using it on medium format, anywhere above 8 or 9mm, you are potentially getting some issues like this. But of course, I say potentially because if you want the shot, it could make all the difference. So it's a matter of choice. You just have to be wary of that fall off in choice there. Likewise, towards the middle of the frame here, you're getting great sharp results, f5.6. Up here, you want f8. And if you want detail up in towards the edges here with much shift, you really want to go to f11. And I can hear the howls from the people who are into diffraction, being the great evil that it is, saying how can you even consider going to f11 with a 100 megapixel camera like this? Very easily, all the time. I'll do it if need be. Let's have a look down at another example. Nearby building. This is one that I've got. Some of you may have seen this large print of this building taken over there. But this is one where I did the original pictures for the architect practice that designed this building. And it's not far from here, and so it's been added to my set of lens testing buildings. And here we have, this time I've turned the camera around. I'm using it in portrait mode. I've got I mentioned this in a video the other day, I've got the Rigetti L bracket here, so it's really quick and easy to swap round between the two orientations about using an L bracket like that. But we've shifted upwards. When you're using the landscape mode like that, pushing it, you really are touching towards the edge of the image circle, and you can see at the top here, this won't be full shift. This is fairly, I've shifted as much as required. You see I've got a little bit of darkening here. Now that's easily fixable in Photoshop. If you have a subject which sticks to the middle of the frame, then having the sky darkened in the corners like that is not necessarily that much of a problem. Much easier to fix than if there was important building detail there. Now there you have to be a bit more careful about it. But there we go, picture of the yard. Now in this particular shot, there's a place right down in the corner of here that I use for looking at wide angle coverage. And I've got this in the written review of the Canon version of the Laowa 20mm, the 15mm that I tested on this, and several others. It just shows coverage quite nicely. What I've got is, this is where I was taking it, and there's the camera set up here. It's just a phone shot, and you can see I'm quite close to the building, and this is with maximal shift. How much of the building can I fit in? Well, there we go. There's the view I get from that viewpoint there, with maximum shift to try and get the corner of the building in. So that's 25. That's the full frame. You'll notice it's gone really quite dark in the corner here. Now that's fixable. I'll show in a moment. But that is the view with the GFX sensor, native sensor, 100 megapixel. There is an option to switch over to 35mm cropping of this, which just takes the equivalent of a 36 by 24mm area of the sensor and uses that for it. And that is the 24 at 24, so 35mm crop. See immediately the aspect ratio has gone from 4:3 to 3:2, and it's quite noticeable of a picture like this. If we go back again, see the extra width we get from that. So that's the 24mm at maximum shift, and that's cropping at as a 35mm sensor. Notice we lose the top of the building there. This is an extreme just to show the difference between it, but that's changing nothing but the cropping. So the shift is the same. This is full shift for 35mm, and the other one was for 4.3, the medium format sensor. Just to show you, just to finish off on that one, there's the image from the full frame, quickly cleaned up in Photoshop to get rid of the dark sky here. Bit of cloning work and whatever. This is just really quickly done. I mean, if you've got clouds and things, you're going to have to work a bit harder. If you've got building detail, then you're really going to have to work a bit harder. But at this focal length, I'm getting a very wide view, and I say it's the equivalent of a 19mm lens. But well, rather than the 3:2 sensor, the 4:3, so I'm getting quite a bit extra in it. So there you go. There's the a quick walkthrough of just what the lens, the Canon TS-E24 F3.5L II does on this. Works very well for it. Now, given this is one of my standard lenses, it makes me think all the more of this particular camera working with it. Now, there are many things I would still, if I had this and my Canon 5DS, there are still things I would use the 5DS for. But yeah, this one really is growing on me. So we shall see. But I'll have a look at some other lenses, and I'll have a look at stuff while I've got it here. I've only got this this particular camera body here for a relatively short while doing some testing. I will come back to it. I'll hopefully get it again when Fuji actually have their new tilt shift lenses to look at. That's a 30mm and a much longer one. Now the longer one, that for me is instantly more for macro studio work, things like that. But we'll give it a try, and I'll try and think up some serious uses for tilt as well that I can illustrate on them, because I know people do want to know about that as well. It's much more complex in some respects. Shift is the easy one to explain. So please do ask questions if you're unsure. I've got lots of resources, he says, pointing at the book, about this, but I've also got lots of articles, written articles, and I've got videos looking at tilt shift lenses. And so there we go, that's the 24. Oh, please do subscribe to the channel, and if you know people interested in these lenses, please do pass on details of the channel. I am trying to even up coverage of printer stuff and lens camera stuff, but I get a much bigger audience for printing than I do for the tilt shift. Doesn't mean I don't want to do this, but I don't necessarily get that many new bits of kit to test out that fall into this category. But feel free, write to me, post comments. It's all appreciated. So thanks for watching, and hope that's been of use.